Okay, so let me begin with something that almost nobody in the mainstream media is actually discussing right now, and I want you to understand why that silence matters. A Russian drone struck a residential building in Galati, Romania, a NATO member state, and killed civilians. Romania, not Ukraine, not some neutral country, a full member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And as of this moment, as of the time I am speaking to you, the President of the United States has issued no statement, no condemnation, no strategic response. The last post from Donald Trump was about fountains that haven't worked in decades. That is not an accident. That is not a distraction. That is a signal. And here is what no one is telling you. This moment reveals the fundamental architecture of how American power is actually collapsing in real time. I am Professor Jiang, and this channel exists to decode power shifts before the headlines catch up. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay locked in, because this one gets worse the deeper you go. Let me establish the baseline facts first. On the night in question, a Russian Shahed 136 drone, a one-way attack drone, meaning it is essentially a flying bomb, crossed into Romanian airspace. It was not shot down. It reached the city of Galati, approximately 13.5 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, and struck a residential apartment building. Multiple civilians were injured. 70 people were evacuated. A fire broke out. Romania's Ministry of Defense confirmed the strike. The F-16 fighter jets that scrambled from the 86th Air Base arrived too late. The damage was done. Now here is the question that matters. Why has the United States said nothing? Why has Donald Trump, who promised to end the war in Ukraine in 24 hours, gone completely silent when a NATO ally is struck by Russian weapons? Let me ask you another question. What does that silence actually mean? And here is where it gets very interesting. Let me bring in the concept that strategists call the credibility trap. This is a structural problem in alliance architecture. When a great power, in this case the United States, makes a security commitment to smaller allies, it creates what economists call a moral hazard. The smaller allies assume the great power will defend them. They make decisions based on that assumption. But if the great power ever signals weakness, or worse, indifference, the entire alliance architecture collapses, not because of a military defeat, because of a loss of faith. Yalsov Triff, a senior analyst, said something very important. Russia may not have intended to hit Romania, but in planning its attack on Ukraine, it does not mind if Romania gets struck once in a while, calculating correctly so far that there will be no price to pay for it. Let that settle for a moment. Russia is calculating. Russia is testing. Russia is asking, what is the cost of hitting a NATO member? And the answer right now appears to be zero. Okay, now I want to talk about what this actually means for NATO's Article 4. Article 4 is the consultation clause. It is not the military response clause. That is Article 5. Article 4 simply requires NATO members to consult when any member perceives a threat to its territorial integrity or security. It is the weakest possible response. It is a conversation. It is not a fighter jet. It is not a missile. It is a meeting. Dr. Malcolm Davis, a defense analyst, said that at the very least, this must activate Article 4, but it is serious enough to potentially trigger Article 5. Article 5 is the collective defense clause. An attack on one is an attack on all. That is the entire foundation of NATO. That is what binds 32 countries together. And yet, as of this moment, there is no indication that Article 5 is being triggered. There is no indication that Article 4 has even been formally invoked. Let me take you back to a historical parallel that illuminates what is happening right now. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy made a decision to blockade Cuba. He did not ask for permission from NATO allies. He did not consult. He acted unilaterally. And the entire Western alliance fell in line because they believed in American credibility. They believed that if America said something, America meant it. That credibility was the real weapon. It was not the missiles. It was the certainty that America would act. Now fast forward to 2025. Trump is withdrawn from NATO's command structure in his rhetoric. He has questioned whether the United States should defend NATO allies who do not spend enough on defense. He has signaled that he views NATO as a financial burden, not a strategic asset. And now, when a NATO ally is actually struck by a Russian drone, he says nothing. He posts about fountains. He posts about reflecting pools. And what does that signal to Romania? What does that signal to Poland? What does that signal to the Baltic states? It signals that American credibility is gone, not weakened, gone. Okay, let me address something directly. I am not saying that Trump should have immediately launched military strikes against Russia. I am not saying that the United States should have responded with overwhelming force. I am saying that the President of the United States should have issued a statement, a single statement, a statement that says an attack on a NATO member is an attack on all NATO members, and there will be consequences. That statement costs nothing. It requires no military action. It is pure credibility, and it was not issued. Now, here is where the analysis gets deeper. Ukraine is currently in a position of relative strength. The Institute for the Study of War has documented that Ukraine is no longer in a defensive posture. Ukraine is now challenging the positional character of the war. Ukraine is regaining territory. Ukraine is conducting deep drone strikes into Russian territory, hitting oil depots, hitting supply lines, hitting the critical R280 highway where Russian fuel tankers are being destroyed. Meanwhile, Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, has said that the United States will no longer push for peace negotiations unless they are productive. He has essentially said, we tried, it did not work, so we are stepping back. And Trump, who promised to end the war in 24 hours, has been completely silent. Let me explain what this actually means for the broader geopolitical architecture. When a great power loses credibility with its allies, those allies begin to make independent decisions. Romania may begin to negotiate directly with Russia. Poland may decide to build its own military capability rather than rely on American guarantees. The Baltic states may seek alternative security arrangements. And once that process begins, it is very difficult to reverse. This is not prophecy. I want you to question everything I am saying. But this is pattern recognition. This is what happened to Britain after World War II. Britain had guaranteed the security of multiple colonial territories. When Britain could no longer afford those guarantees, those territories began to seek independence or align with other powers. The British Empire did not collapse because of a military defeat. It collapsed because credibility evaporated. Okay, let me now synthesize this. The core thesis is this. Trump's silence on the Romania strike is not a tactical mistake. It is a strategic signal. It is a signal that American security guarantees are no longer credible. And once that signal is sent, the entire NATO alliance architecture becomes fragile, not because of military weakness, because of psychological weakness, because allies no longer believe that America will act. Now, you might ask, why would Trump do this? Why would he deliberately undermine American credibility? And the answer is that he may not be doing it deliberately. He may simply not understand what credibility means in alliance architecture. He may view NATO purely as a financial transaction. Countries pay their 2% of GDP, and in return, America provides defense. But that is not how alliances work. Alliances work on trust. Alliances work on the expectation that if you are attacked, your ally will respond, not because of a contract, because of a shared identity, because of a shared commitment to a rules-based order. And when that trust evaporates, the alliance begins to die. Not immediately, but inevitably. Let me be transparent with you about what this means going forward. Romania will likely invoke Article 4. NATO will likely hold meetings. There will be discussions about forward deploying additional NATO forces to the eastern flank. But none of that will restore American credibility. None of that will convince Romania that the United States will actually defend it, because the signal has already been sent. The President of the United States was silent when a NATO ally was attacked. Now, the final question is this: what comes next? If Russia calculates that there is no price to pay for hitting Romania, then Russia will do it again and again. And each time, the cost of American silence will compound. Each time, NATO allies will lose more faith. Each time, the alliance will become weaker. And eventually, you will reach a point where NATO no longer functions as a collective defense organization. It becomes a collection of individual states, each pursuing its own interests. And that is when the real instability begins. That is when you see arms races. That is when you see regional conflicts that spiral out of control. That is when you see the collapse of the post-World War II order that has, despite all its flaws, prevented a great power war for 80 years. I want you to understand something. This is not about Donald Trump. This is about the structure of American power. American power has always rested on credibility, on the belief among allies that America will do what it says it will do. Once that credibility is gone, American power evaporates. Not the military, the power. The ability to shape events without firing a shot. The ability to deter adversaries simply by existing. And right now, that credibility is being systematically destroyed by silence, by indifference, by a president who posts about fountains while a NATO ally bleeds. So here's the final thesis, and I want you to hold this. Trump's silence on Romania is not a failure of communication, it is a declaration. It is a declaration that American security guarantees mean nothing. And once that declaration is made, the entire international order begins to reorganize around that reality. Allies seek other protectors, adversaries become more aggressive, and America, which has dominated the international system for 75 years, begins its inevitable decline. I'm Professor Jiang. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember, the most consequential moments in history often come wrapped in silence.